I didn't watch a lot of media when I was a little kid. My parents tried to do a sort of protectionist attempt with my sister and I, where they would pay us not to watch media. They wanted us to read and use our imaginations and that kind of stuff. But then they would go on date nights, and my sister would rent us a whole bunch of scary movies. So my indoctrination into the genre was watching a Clive Barker double bill of Hellraiser and Candyman. And I don't know, I guess I just got hooked on scares. It was something my sister and I had that we would do together, and it just kind of blossomed from there.
I was allowed to watch TV and movies, and I also read books and used my imagination and things. But
yes, Trace, treat it like it's a personal dig against you.
No. My family was very like into TV and movies, so we were a family that like went to the movies every single weekend in the movie theater. We had 5 TVs in our house, and every night at least 4 of them were recording something on a VHS tape from 7 to 10 p.m. And we would spend our weekends watching the things on those tapes so we could clear them and tape over them the next week for the next week's shows. I don't even know why I got into horror. I think it was the aspect of like I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies, or again R-rated movies specifically, because I latched on to Tremors and Critters and things like that a lot growing up. Temple of Doom was my favorite Indiana Jones movie for a multitude of reasons. But yeah, my dad and I bonded over it. So whenever my mom, the few times my mom would go out of town, he would rent me a bunch of R-rated horror movies, and we would watch them together.
So speaking of the podcast, so how did you two eventually meet, and then how did the idea for the podcast kind of get started, and how it like got off the ground?
Joe, you're good at this.
Sure, yes. So a lot of people are surprised to know that we didn't really know each other very well before we started the podcast. And we've actually come to hear that that's a fairly common thing. There's a lot of people who started podcasts in and around the pandemic or a couple of years before that they knew someone, they liked someone, they respected someone and said, hey, do you want to do this project with me? So in this case, Trace and I were both writers for Bloody Disgusting, and I noticed that he was the only person who ever talked about his sexuality in his film reviews. And so I kind of felt like, oh, we're the only 2 people who are maybe outwardly queer. We now know that's totally not true. There's a ton of queer people who work at Bloody. But it was easier to identify Trace. So I approached him and was like, hey, we should write together and just do these article series where we'll review a film through a kind of queer lens, and we can just do it back and forth. And over time, we realized that not only was it harder to get sort of genuine reactions and be able to like flesh out our ideas, but also people preferred to hear us talk about it. So when we started the podcast, it was a year after the articles had begun, and we would try to alternate. Like we'd say, oh, we're doing an article on that, and people would be like, I don't really want to read the article, I'd rather hear you 2 talk about it.
When it comes to the films that you cover, just kind of the films you look at, for you, what makes a horror film queer horror? Because there are obviously horror films that are very openly queer, but then you mentioned something like Hocus Pocus, which isn't directly queer, but when you really start to peel back the layers, you realize like there's a lot of things here for queer people to identify with, or there's just a lot of things that correspond.
I will give Joe credit for this, because I used to be a real stickler about like, no, like it's a queer horror podcast, we have to find something with explicit queerness, and I was like, we're gonna rent out the movies to talk about. And the more research you do on these films, so it used to be, we would start looking for things with a queer, explicit queer content, but then we were like, well, let's broaden it out a little bit. It could be a queer actor, it could be a queer director, a queer writer. It could be, like with Hocus Pocus, like queer sensibilities. I mean, the witches are drag queens, so it's something we find in that. But at the end of the day, I think where we are now, I mean, we're in our 5th year of this podcast. Ultimately, we can kind of make anything we want queer, because we are the queer lens through which we are looking at these films. So, we might have some films that are more off-kilter picks that are like, oh, that doesn't really scream queer, and we might, as some of our detractors would say, reach for a queer reading. But again, it's our show.
Yeah, and we found interesting angles. Like, I remember when we covered The Rage Carrie 2 in our first year, we decided to use that film as a way to talk about our own experiences with bullying. And then when we talked about Oculus, we talked about the importance of familial, like, sibling relationships.
Right.
And both of those we ended up reading through our own respective queer elements, like our own histories. And then we ended up getting a lot of feedback from people saying, even though this film doesn't really have that strong queer horror element that I was thinking it was going to have, I think a lot of people felt like it connected to them or it resonated with their own stories. So that's, I think, when we started to let go a little bit of, oh, if it doesn't have a queer character explicitly in it, we can't cover it.
Of course, now it's getting easier though, because I feel like queer characters in horror films are becoming like constant.
Yes. Yeah.
So, in your years of covering queer horror films in general, what is a film that you've come across that you feel kind of best represents either LGBTQ plus people, themes, struggles? What's kind of one that you really look to as like, this is like a gold standard?
We might have the same answer for this, Joe.
Is it Knife Plus Heart?
It was Knife Plus Heart. Yeah, that is absolutely what I was going to say.
Yeah, so Knife Plus Heart is a 2019 film. It's French by director Jan Gonzalez. The entire cast is composed of queer people. It's set in the late 70s on a gay porn film set that's being stalked, and the actors are being killed by a man in a mask. He uses a dildo knife to kill his victims, so it's very like penetrative, very sexual. But it's also like inspired by Italian giallo. The color scheme is wild. It's got a bunch of surrealist nightmare stuff in the back half. But at the end of the day, it's so predominantly queer. And then you can do the reading where specifically it's set right before the AIDS crisis, and it kind of foretells the end of like a sexual liberation. And I don't know, I think it's a really complicated, really interesting, really beautiful film. And it's, to me, also an example of European cinema where Hollywood can talk a big game about, oh, this film is like really queer. And I'm just like, well, let's take a look at what some other countries are doing, because international cinema is still, I would argue, more boundary pushing and progressive when it comes to queer horror than North America.
I think what also sets Knife Plus Heart apart too is the killer himself. I mean, that's not gonna be a spoiler to say, but like the killer himself is queer and has a tragic backstory through his queerness, and the film does explore that. But I think also for the longest time, whenever someone was like, oh, look, a queer horror film, the one movie that always came up that everyone was like, oh yeah, that's the gay movie, was Hellbent. And Hellbent is an American gay slasher directed by Paul Etheridge. But that's one where it's more, I say simple, but I use that as like a term of endearment, not as a negative. But it's very much about, oh, this group of queer men in West Hollywood and on Halloween night, and they are stalked by a man in a devil costume. It doesn't really like go beyond that. Like, I do think Knife Plus Heart has a lot more layers to it. But again, does Hellbent like really represent all of queer men? No, it doesn't. It's very much one body type in that movie. But I think it's also like, it was pioneering. Like, that was what, 2000?
It's a prototype, yeah.
2005, yeah. So
it's one of those films where when we didn't have other examples of it, like, you know, I actually thought, Trace, you were going to say, oh, the one that people reference is Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which is not even explicitly queer. It's queer coded. And of course, now we know that, you know, Mark is a gay man, and he's got like his own tragic backstory that was really perfectly captured in a documentary. But, you know, to me, that's an interesting case of like horror cinema trying to capture something but not having the language or having homophobia sort of layering on top of it. Whereas we're in a day and age now where films can be explicitly labeled as queer horror, and it's like the market they're actively trying to tap into.
When it comes to recommending horror films, whether it be to people who are familiar with the genre, looking for something new, or say people who are trying to get into the genre, and what other films are queer horror or other subgenres, anything like that, what's kind of the one film that you like would always recommend to somebody?
I guess it's just one of my favorites, but I would always be like, hey, watch the entire Scream franchise. Because not only is it a queer creator, I mean, Kevin Williamson wrote 1, 2, 4, and has been directly involved with 5 and 6. It's also, I mean, slashers being one of my favorite subgenres. That's always kind of my go-to, because I also think that, especially even the first Scream, like, it's a horror movie, it's trying to scare you, and it is gory, but I also think that's a horror movie that if someone is wary of the horror genre because they're like, I don't like being scared, I don't like being like grossed out or whatever. I think that does a really good job of like balancing things out with all those aspects.
Yeah, and I'll take the flip side. So Trace and I have we share two of the same
favorite subgenres.
What am I even trying to say? We like two of the same subgenres of horror. So one is slashers, and the other one is aquatic horror or creature features. And I think that's a sort of soft way to get in for people who don't like horror, because you can say, oh, do you like Jaws? Or do you like something silly like Anaconda, where you get to watch J-Lo battle a giant snake? Or something, scary, but also kind of vacation-y, where like Rogue is set in the Australian outback.
And see, though, Rogue is an interesting pick, though, because like if I ever recommend Rogue to someone, I'm always like, hey, it is really good, but just a heads up, this is not a crocodile eating a person every 10 minutes movie. Like, it's a slow build to a great climax. But I showed that movie to so many people, and they're like, that's a really boring movie.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think part of what I always have to do is, instead of just directly giving someone a recommendation, I ask them, hey, have you seen a movie lately that you've enjoyed? And then I try to think, okay, what's a comparable film? Like, I know that Trace likes aquatic horror films, and we had to do a guest spot on a podcast recently. So I was like, how about we do a movie you haven't seen, which was Orca from 1977. And then I tried to like give him conditions to be like, so it is a bit slower, it's not super gory. And then he came out of it being like, oh, it was actually way gorier, and like there were more animal attacks than I expected.
But again, though, I think it's required. As you said, you have to ask people like what kind, because as we've already said, the genre sandbox is so vast. You don't have these subgenres of you have romantic comedy, you have parody, whatever, dramas, like you have like the subject matter, but not like the type of film it is. And I think there's just so much more variety and different variables in genre films that I think you have to, like, if someone says give me a horror movie, I'm like, okay, I have about 5 follow-up questions.
Yeah, exactly.